Yo, 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 welcome to another episode of We Think Too. And today we'll discuss a guest that Tucker Carlson had on his show earlier this month that asserts that blacks in general score lower on an IQ test than whites and Asians. Let's watch the clip and see what you think.
So that if you have, well, I have the data in the book. Essentially, you have registered nurses, and we have data on fairly large numbers of registered nurses, black and white. And the difference in mean IQ between the two of those is a dozen IQ points, which is a lot. It means you have a whole lot of extremely able black nurses. You have some incompetent white nurses, but it does mean you have a difference in job performance. And that's eventually going to be reflected in income as well. It's going to be reflected in the nature of their careers and the nature of how they end up and so forth. Same thing goes with virtually all kinds of jobs. The same thing goes for the kinds of jobs people end up in, so that you have entry into certain kinds of occupations is limited because the cognitive demands of those occupations mean that a whole lot of more white people qualify than black people, and even a higher proportion of Asian people qualify than white people. These are all differences which are driven not by irrational racism, they are driven by day-to-day realities of job performance and the responses of supervisors to job performances and the demands of the market. I'm not saying all of it, by the way. In all of this, in talking about these things, is Murray saying that racism is no longer a factor in American life? No. Racism is a factor in American life. I'm saying that you can't understand the size of the factor it is without understanding the proportion of the differences that are reasonable and logical and predictable.
Charles Murray was a guest of Tucker Carlson this month, and he asserts that the intellectual inferiority of black people are the reasons for not getting certain jobs that require higher cognitive skills. The IQ results from his book alleges that there is no systematic racism, and black people are about 12 points lower on the IQ scale. And he further adds that the evidence is revealed in the performance of the worker and or evaluations given by the supervisors. What do you think? The guest is an MIT and Harvard graduate and an established author. We got that, but look, let's dig just a little deeper, and please know that I bring this up to help bring awareness to why and how some white men and women are under the strongest convictions that they are more intelligent than the average black person. It comes from foolishness like this.
And the setup has a familiar smell.
Rhetorical question. Why would Tucker Carlson have this kind of commentary? Let's face it, most job seekers of any culture are not adding their IQ score to an application and probably haven't even taken the test. I'm sure there are some careers out there that would require that you take an IQ test, but they're not that many. So to imply that black people in general are intellectually inferior, which leads to being less qualified for jobs, is just unfounded and irrelevant. Let's quickly dig into the origin of the intelligence quotient test. All right, so in the early 1900s, the French government asked Alfred Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon to help decide which students were most likely to experience difficulty in school, not work, because their government had passed laws requiring that all French children attend school. So it was important to find a way to identify children who would need specialized assistants for school. When the scale was brought to the United States, it generated a lot of interest. So, a Stanford University psychologist named Louis Terman,
They called his kids the termites.
took Binet's original test and standardized it as it became the basis for the modern IQ test that we have now. Now, was it a coincidence that at the time Louis Terman was also a strong advocate for eugenics? I don't know, but we'll discuss eugenics later. You know what's funny? Alfred Binet thought that the IQ tests were inadequate measures for intelligence due to its inability to properly measure creativity or emotional intelligence. So picture that with a Kodak.
You have entry into certain kinds of occupations is limited because the cognitive demands of those occupations mean that a whole lot of more white people qualify than black people, and even a higher proportion of Asian people qualify than white people. These are all differences which are driven not by irrational racism, they are driven by day-to-day realities of job performance and the responses of supervisors to job performance.
Check. When we think about intelligence, it's most thought of in two separate buckets: crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. Now, crystallized intelligence is an aggregate of prior experiences and knowledge, while fluid intelligence is a measure of how responsive one would be to new information, solving new problems that don't quite mesh with your crystallized intelligence or some things you may already know. Now, just from those descriptions, you can deduct that everyone's intelligence will be slightly different. So I ask you to look at general intelligence as you would athleticism. A hockey player is definitely athletic, but surely not the same type of athleticism as a football player. But you wouldn't dare say that the hockey player is not an athlete. You see where I'm going? Here's why I'm so adamant about these assertions from the author. It's because our history tells us that small fires definitely can lead to big uncontrollable forest fires. The IQ score once had a dark side, and the author tries to carefully use the medical profession as an example. But I'm looking through that. Reason being, he mentioned black people scoring 12 points lower than whites and even more than Asians. This is where eugenics come in. The IQ score helped the eugenics movement, which was started by Francis Dalton in the late 1800s. Now, the movement began to take root in the United States in the early 1900s, parenthetically during the Jim Crow era, as a spin from the IQ score that was used to determine those that require special educational needs. Eugenics, in a simple definition, means quote unquote well born. Okay. The establishment of the American Breeders Association were just getting started during this time as well. You might want to look that up. This eugenics movement led to the involuntary sterilization of people that were perceived to be feeble-minded and later called imbeciles by a Supreme Court judge, most of which were poor and or black. So this movement hit an inflection point when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of sterilizing during the Bell versus Buck case of Virginia in 1927. Many states instituted laws which resulted in the forced sterilization of over 64,000 people in the United States. Now, at this time, sterilization efforts were really focused on the disabled, but later grew to include people whose only crime was poverty. Look, regardless of how many ultra success stories we have of individuals from all backgrounds that do not possess college or even a high school education, somehow we still use the IQ score as the most likely to succeed measure, despite the fact that it does not factor in emotional intelligence and other behavioral traits that impact your general knowledge. So to the author, I say, what exactly are you saying? I agree with one thing. We don't know how this is going to turn out, but it has less to do with cognition than it does true content of the heart. I say that because regardless of how much data you present, we shall never forget that slavery was perfectly legal. And then the laws and policy to follow allow for elements like sharecropping, redlining, voter restriction, voter suppression, which independently helped set the conditions to all of the data that you presented. So again, the author may appear to speak from a neutral corner, but it's clear that if you ignore the heavy-handed mixed role the law has played over the last century, then you are also ignoring the effects of disenfranchising, the effects of segregation, and the effects of constant marginalizing. That is systematic racism. In my opinion, the author talked himself into a circle. And we all know that means you've gone absolutely nowhere. That's my time for the day. I pray that you keep a watchful eye, and as things begin to look calm on the surface, the battle still continues. Thanks for tuning in to We Think Too.